In this video, I will give a brief overview and a demonstration of how to perform a technique to deal with missing data called multiple imputation. This technique is used when we have data that may be missing due to non-response or due to dropout of subjects. And if we want to maintain sample size, or if we have a situation in which data that's missing is missing in a systematic way, which may introduce some bias, it's in our best interest, in order to develop a good hypothesis decision, that we replace the data in some way. Now, in other videos, I talked about techniques of dealing with missing data called trimming and Windsorizing, in which we just basically remove subjects that have data that are missing. And that's certainly appropriate when we have small numbers of missing data, usually less than 5%. But if we have large numbers of missing data, or trimming or Windsorizing is not appropriate because it may significantly reduce the sample size, we can try and replace the missing data with one of these techniques. And the more common, and probably one of the more accepted ones that these days, is called multiple imputation. This is also used a lot if we have longitudinal data in which we have multiple data points in which we might have subject mortality or dropout, and we want to try and do an intention to treat analysis and incorporate the missing data in the analysis. And so one of the technique we're going to discuss in this video is called multiple imputation. Now, what multiple imputation does, it basically runs simulations on the missing data relative to the data that's available, in an attempt to replace the missing data with data that is most likely, or would be most likely, to be similar to the current data, the data that's available. So it basically looks at patterns in the available data and then makes a probability judgment as to what the missing values would probably be, or would most likely be. And then it replaces those missing values with these imputed values in order to then create a full data set. So the data set we're going to work with here in the demonstration it's a hypothetical data set, and it's got several variables that are both numerical and categorical, and it has missing values in it. And so we're going to go through the step-by-step process of how we first analyze the missing data to try and determine if there are any patterns, or if it's random types of missing data. And the first step is to analyze to determine if there are patterns in the missing data, and then go through the process of actually imputing the values based upon a given method. And we'll talk about the different options that we have as we go through this step by step. So our first step then in the process is to evaluate the missing values. In other words, determine if there is some kind of a pattern to the missing data points. So our first step is to go to the Analyze menu, click on Multiple Imputation, and then click on Analyze Patterns. Now, the defaults that we see here, we're going to pretty much leave alone. And what this will first do, as I mentioned, is look for patterns in the data to try and determine if the missing data is systematic or if it's random. Now, depending on if it's systematic, there is one multiple imputation technique that will be used versus if the data is random. And SPSS will kind of help us make that decision as far as which technique we will use. So our first step then is to select all of the variables except the ID variable. That's just an identification variable, so we don't want it to analyze that variable. So we want to select all the variables that we have, and depending on how many you have, we want to select them all. So we move them over into the Analyze Across Variables box. Now, once we get the output, SPSS is going to display, or we can designate how many variables SPSS will display simultaneously. We only have 17 variables, so the default is to look at 25 variables simultaneously. So we're going to leave that alone. Now the next thing we need to tell SPSS to do is to display a variable that's missing data as long as it meets a certain criteria. So the default indicates that the only variables with 10% or more missing values will be analyzed and displayed in the output. Now, it's generally good practice to try and review all the patterns of missing data. So some people will say if it's missing less than 5%, I don't need to worry about it. That's kind of one rule of thumb that we have, because if it's missing less than 5%, we're just going to trim it, and we're not going to worry about it. But it is, as I mentioned, good practice to try and evaluate all the missing data, even if it's less than just 5%, so that we can see if there is some sort of a pattern. So we're going to change this minimum percentage missing to 0.01%. So even if a variable is missing just a very small handful of data points, it will still analyze it and evaluate it, and then we can make a decision as far as how we're going to deal with it. All right, so once we've made that change, we want to go ahead and click the OK button. And so now we'll see here is the output from this analysis. And there are several things we're going to see. We're first going to see a series of pie charts, 3 pie charts. Now the pie charts display the number and percentage of missing variables. That's the left-hand pie chart. So it's going to show how many variables have missing data. So in this case, the green represents incomplete data. So all 17 variables have some missing data. The center pie chart is the cases. Okay, so that's how many subjects or how many cases are missing some value, at least one value, and it appears that about 860, or a little bit more than half of the subjects, are missing at least one value. And then the right-hand pie chart that's labeled values, that indicates that 5% of all values are missing. So if we take our 17 variables, multiply it by our 1,500 cases or subjects, there's 25,500 potential values. And so according to this chart, we've got about 1,246 missing values throughout the entire sample. So that's about just a little bit short of 5%. So it looks as though all the variables have some missing data. Individual subjects, more than half of them are missing at least one data point. And of all the possible cells or all the possible values that we have available to us, a little less than 5% are incomplete. So for some people, they might say, well, less than 5%, I don't really need to do anything about this. I'm just going to trim them and then move on. With a number of 1,500, that might seem a fairly large sample size, so trimming a certain percentage might not seem a lot, but when we're thinking about the values, we're saying that there's about 1,200 values missing. So that could indicate to us there's some sort of pattern here, because that's a large number of pieces of data missing. And so now the sample, even though it's a small number of subjects that are missing data, it might seem like a small percentage of pieces of data are missing. That still represents more than half of our subjects are missing data. So that's a problem. We're probably going to have some level of bias here. So the next thing we want to do then is move on to the variable summary chart and examine that and try and get a feel for whether or not there's some sort of a pattern here. And so the variable summary chart is going to list all of the variables that have at least 0.101% of missing values. And so the number of missing values, the percentage missing, the number of valid values, the mean based on the valid values, as well as the standard deviation based on the valid values are all listed in this table for each of our 17 variables. And so you'll notice that the variables are ordered by the amount of values they are missing based upon percentage missing. So extroversion, that variable, is listed first because it has the highest percentage of missing values, about 5.5%. And neuroticism is listed at the bottom of the table because it has the lowest percentage of missing values. So this gives you an idea of which variables seem to be missing the most values, and also gives us some descriptive information on the means and variance of the valid values. Now the next thing we can examine is a chart called the missing value pattern. Now this is displayed to allow us a chance to examine whether or not there is some pattern to the missing data. So each row represents a certain pattern, in other words, a group of cases with the same pattern of missing values. In other words, the patterns or groups of cases are displayed based upon where the missing values are located relative to each variable. So the variables along the bottom, or the x-axis, are ordered by the amount of missing values that each one contains. So considering the table, neuroticism has the lowest percentage of missing values and is therefore listed first, or on the left-hand side of the x-axis. While extroversion, which has the largest percentage of missing values, is listed last, or to the right. So, for example, the first pattern, the one listed here at the top, is always one which contains no missing values. And then the second pattern reflects only cases with missing values on the neuroticism variable. So what we're looking for here is something called monotonicity. In other words, kind of a rigid pattern of decreasing or increasing values across the sequence. So what we look for is a pattern in the organization of these red lines, indicating that there's missing values. Now, if we had a concentration of red lines in the upper left, and then another concentration of red lines in the lower right, that would indicate that there's some sort of pattern, in other words, monotonicity. When we have islands of non-missing values like we see here, so we have some concentration of red to the upper left, and also some concentration of red to the lower right, but we have these little patches of non-missing values. So if we had all the red touching to the upper left and also touching to the lower right, that would indicate a pattern. But as you can see here, we have these islands of non-missing values, and so that would indicate, and if you look at these red lines here, you can see that they look like they're randomly arranged. There's really no pattern to how these red lines are organized in the center of this graph. And so that would indicate then that the missing values are probably missing in a random pattern. There's no systematic pattern to how these values are missing. So that's a good thing. That means that minimizes the chance we might have bias in our missing values. In other words, there's not one question that most of the subjects didn't answer, or there's not a series of questions that subjects were not answering or not responding to. So that's a good thing, indicating that there's randomness to the missing values. If there's non-randomness to the missing values, then that's going to move us in one direction as far as the options we choose for doing the multiple imputation. If it is random, then that moves us in another option for how we would do the multiple imputation. Okay, the next graph we can look at as we move down the outcome here is labeled as variable, and this is the pattern frequencies graph. And this graph shows that the first pattern, the one in which no missing values are present across all variables, is the most prevalent. So that's what's indicated here in this large bar. So what this is saying is the most common pattern that we see is that there's no values missing across all the variables. The other patterns are much less prevalent. In other words, there are certain patterns of missing values across all the variables are much less prevalent, but they're roughly equal. In other words, the patterns of certain kinds of missing values across the variables is pretty consistent. Okay, so we've analyzed our missing values, and we've determined a couple of things here. First of all, obviously there are missing values, and there's a fairly large number of missing values. More than half of our subjects are missing at least one value. There's missing values in all 17 of our variables. We've also determined that there doesn't appear to be a pattern to how the values are missing. In other words, it appears to be kind of a random arrangement of missing values across all the variables, and that by far and away the most common pattern we're seeing is no missing values, but there is a number of patterns that indicate missing values across multiple variables. So that tells us that we probably should move on to the multiple imputation and go ahead and replace those missing values so that we can flesh out or fill out our data set. And so our second step then is to go ahead and impute the missing data values. So what multiple imputation actually does, it actually goes through a process of trying to find the data that's missing and try and simulates it so that it matches up or seems to best fit with the data that's available. So it actually goes through several what we call iterations and comes up with several results of new data to replace the missing data and tries to find an iteration that creates the best fit. So it might do this 3 times, it might do it 5 times, it might do it 100 times until it can find missing values that seem to fit best with the values that are already there, that are present. And so in order for it to do that, in order for it to do its multiple simulations or multiple iterations, we need to give SPSS some instructions as far as how we want it to generate these random iterations. And so what we need to do, and this is referred to as setting the random seed, in other words, giving it some guidelines and some parameters for how we want it to randomly generate numbers to create these iterations for these missing values. So what we need to do is go to the Transform menu and choose Random Number Generators. And so this is going to then kind of tell SPSS how we want it to develop these iterations, these models for the missing data. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is select or check the box that says Set Active Generator. Okay, and then we're actually going to choose the Mersenne Twister, which is a random number generator program. Okay, and the next thing we need to do is set starting point. And then we want to choose fixed value. And then we're going to go ahead and keep the value at its default. Okay, once that's done, we click OK. So now we can actually conduct the multiple imputation. So we start this by going back to the Analyze menu. Choose Multiple Imputation. And then choose Impute Missing Data Values. Okay, and so now we're going to see a decision box similar to other ones we've seen in SPSS. Okay, so first thing we need to do is select all the variables. So we know that all 17 variables have missing values, so we want to do multiple imputation for all 17 variables. Now if we only had a handful of variables that had missing values, we would just move those over. But in this case, we're going to move all 17 over, again, except that ID variable, because it's not data, it's just an identification. So we want to highlight all of these. Okay, and we want to move those over into the variables in model box. Okay. All right. Now, we want to create a new data set from this imputation. So we want to make sure we click Create a New Data Set. And we want to name it. And so this data set will contain these newly generated or imputed values in place of the missing values. Now you'll notice that the imputation box here lists 5, which is the default. And so that means it's going to run 5 imputations or 5 simulations performed in sequence. And during each imputation, the missing values are imputed, in other words, generated in order to create a model that fits it. And then at the end of the imputations, in this case 5, the values are averaged together to take into account the variance of the missing values. And so this is why the procedure is called multiple imputation, because what we end up with is one set of imputed values, but these values are actually aggregates of multiple imputed values. And so imagine that the 4th case is missing the extroversion score. The 4th subject is missing extroversion score. So that score will be imputed or simulated 5 times and stored in data sets. And then those 5 values will be averaged, and the resulting single value will be used as the new value that will replace the missing value, and that will then be used in the primary analysis for the study. So each subject will get that process for each variable that they might be missing data. And so it's going to go through 5 imputations to try and generate a missing value. And so it's important to realize that multiple imputation is a strategy or a process, and there are many methods of going about the process. But it's certainly not the best. As far as this technique is certainly not the best one. There's many other methods, and we'll talk about that when we actually get to choosing our method. But what we want to do is go ahead and name our data set, and so we're going to call it New Imputed Data. And then once we have done that, we then click on the Method tab. And then this is where we're going to choose which method. Now, SPSS has 2 methods available, the Markov chain Monte Carlo method and the monotone method. Now we're going to use the automatic function because what this automatic function will do, it'll scan the data for monotonicity. It'll again kind of pretty much do what we did with that one chart where we looked at the red bars and the white bars. And if it discovers that there is monotonicity, in other words, there's a pattern to the missing data, then it will use the monotone method. Otherwise, if there's random variation or randomness to the missing values, it's going to default to the Markov chain Monte Carlo method. Now you can choose the custom method if you feel you want to use the Monte Carlo method. You can actually change the number of iterations that it may do to try and increase the likelihood of getting a correct model. In other words, what we call attaining convergence, meaning the estimates are no longer fluctuating more than just a small amount from iteration to iteration. In most cases, if we've got random missing values, we can do that in 5 iterations or so. You can also then choose the model in which you wish to use, and the most common is the linear regression model for doing these Monte Carlo iterations, or if you feel like you have a pattern, you have monotonicity, then you can choose the monotone method. We're going to let SPSS do the heavy lifting here, and we're going to choose the automatic method and let SPSS decide which technique should be used, the Monte Carlo method or the monotone method. Okay, the next thing to do is click on the Constraints tab. Okay, the first thing we want to do is click under the Constraints tab is go ahead and click the Scan Data button. Okay, and it's going to give us the kind of the descriptives for each of our variables as far as the percent missing, the observed minimum and observed maximum score in our data. Now we can use this information in the defined constraints table. Now for some variables there are a finite number of valid values. In other words, if we're measuring something like body fat percentage, we know there's only certain valid values that should be there. So when the process is done, we want to make sure SPSS only imputes or comes up with values that are valid. We don't want to end up with having a body fat percentage of 105. So we can indicate to it what the minimum and maximum values should be. Now, categorical variables are automatically dummy coded, so coming up with a minimum or maximum are not really necessary. So what we need to do is go through the table and make sure that the observed minimum and observed maximum values are valid measures, are within a range that we would consider to be acceptable and normal. And so we want to make sure that that is the case. If we happen to find values, minimum or maximum values that are outside of an acceptable range, we can then go down to the next box here and define what we want the minimum and maximum to be. And we can also have program round values as well. So if we've got fractional values, we can tell it we want it to round up or round down in a certain way. Now in the case of some variables, like for example, I'm in the defined constraints box here, and how many drinks someone has per week or how many absences someone has from school or work, we know that the minimum of that could actually be 0. So we want to make sure that that SPSS recognizes that that is the kind of the minimum possible score. There is the possibility of having 0. Now another thing we can do is define the role of our particular variables. In other words, is it a predictor or is it an outcome? And so we can also then define in the role whether or not we want to impute and use as either a predictor or as an outcome. Now and that's typically only going to be used when we're using the linear regression model. And so we don't really need to worry about this if we're doing the automatic option. So we can just leave this as it is, and it doesn't really change very much the process. Now our next step is to choose the Output tab. And this is where we're going to get a chance to specify what is displayed in the output window. So we want to make sure we choose Descriptive Statistics for variables with imputed values. And we also want to create an iteration history. And so what this is going to do then is it's going to give us descriptive information for each iteration that the process has gone through. So we talked about, we have 5 iterations, so we're going to see what the imputed values looked like as far as mean and variance for each of our iterations, and then we're also going to see the pooled means and standard deviations after each of those iterations. So it's instructive to be able to look at these different iterations to see how much they vary, not only from the original data, but also from the pooled data, and it just kind of gives us an idea of how much each iteration varies from the other iterations, and gives us an idea of how accurate the iterations may be. If we're seeing very little differences from iteration to iteration to iteration, then that indicates that the pooled variances or the pooled values we're going to come up with at the end of the process are probably going to be pretty accurate, and there's going to be very little error in what the missing values are relative to what they possibly may have actually been. The iterated or the imputed missing values, what they would actually be relative to if they weren't missing. So we also want to correct or create a new data set. So we want to make sure that's chosen. And then we want to name it. And so in this case, we're going to name it iteration history. So again, this will give us an output that will show the means and variances for each of our different iterations. All right, once we've completed that, we can go ahead and click the OK button. And if you look down here at the lower right, you can see just above the toolbar here, it's showing that it's running the multiple imputations. And just next to it, you'll see which iteration it is on, is it is running each of these multiple imputations. So it's actually going through several iterations. Now, as we talked about before, depending on the process, it may go through multiple iterations, and this may take a while for it to go through the process and give us our outputs. So, we've specified that it should go through about 100 iterations for each of the 5 imputations. So it's going to go through multiple simulations for each imputation. So when the process finishes, let's go back and look at our data. So we're going to go back to the data file now. We go back to our data file. You're going to notice we have 2 new data files, one called new imputed data and then one called iteration history. And we're going to have, if you look at the output, you're going to see we have quite a lot of new output. So first, let's take a look at the imputed data set. So let's click on new imputed data. And so what you'll notice, there's going to be several differences in the data editor in this file compared to what we saw in the original data. And 3 things stand out. The missing values that we see here, okay, and we're going to see the new variable on the far left side called imputation. And so this identifies the data as far as whether it was the original data and which imputation it is. So again, we're going to have 0 represents old data, and then also a 1 would then represent the first imputation, what the data looked like, and then what looked like in the second imputation, and so on. And then the third thing we can look at is a little cube here that is yellow and white, and it has a drop-down menu. And this allows us to kind of move back and forth between the original data and each of our 5 imputations. And so if I click on the 1 here, you'll see it drops down automatically now to the data from the first imputation. And so what we'll see then in the yellow shaded cells, that's where the missing data was replaced. And this is the first imputation of that missing data. So we have age replaced here for this subject. We have class standing as well as a rating here in this cell, and so now we have the data replaced. And so we can move through each of these imputations and see how the data has been slightly different in each imputation. So this imputation variable here basically labels each of the sets of data. So again, the first set labeled 0 is the original data, the first 1,500 cases with the missing values still present. And then each set of imputed data will then be represented. And so, as I mentioned, SPSS marks the cells which contain imputed values by highlighting them so that we can identify really quickly which set of data we're looking at. Now, another important thing to notice is that this imputed data file, which isn't really obvious, is the fact that the data editor is aware that this file is an imputed data file. So when you click on Analyze and then run some analysis, which we'll do in a second, you'll notice that many of the analysis options are compatible with imputed data, but some are not. So each analysis or function which shows an icon that kind of looks like a cube with a swirl in it or next to it, will automatically be run using the aggregated imputed data. So in other words, it will know that we have 5 sets of imputed data. SPSS will then aggregate this imputed data and come up with kind of a pooled or aggregated set of data that includes the missing values, and then it will run the analysis on that pooled data or pooled estimates. So let's do a quick example and I'll show you what I mean. So let's go ahead and run a t-test on some of this data. So we go to Analyze and then go to Compare Means. And now you'll see here's our little grid with that swirl next to it, which means that this imputed data can be analyzed using one of these techniques. And so let's go ahead and run an independent samples t-test. And we're going to compare males and females. So we're going to do sex as our grouping variable, our independent variable. And so we're using a 1 and a 2 is our grouping code. And the outcome we're going to test them on is on number grade. So let's find that at the bottom. Yep, number grade. So that's going to be our outcome. Okay. And now what we do is we click OK. And in the output, we're going to see something a little bit unique. Okay, is what we're going to see is group statistics for the original data. So here's the group means for our original data. And then here's the group means for each of our different imputations, 1 through 5. And then we lastly have our pooled data. So this is where SPSS took these 5 different imputations of data, pooled the means and the variances to come up with a pooled mean and pooled standard error. And so this is the actual values that SPSS will then use in the independent samples t-test. And what you'll also see then, as you page down, is it will do the same thing. It'll do a t-test for each of the different 5 imputations. But the one we need to use and the one we need to focus on and report is for the pooled imputations. And so as we look at the t-score, the t-value then, for this pooled imputed data, we can see we have a t-score of, if we're assuming equal variances, of minus 1.948. And so that's a p-value that's greater than 0.05. So depending on how we are doing our hypothesis testing, we would then say that these 2 groups are not significantly different. Now, if we look at the original data with that missing, all those missing values, it actually would be considered statistically significant. So replacing the missing data with this imputed data actually made a difference in this case as whether or not we're going to accept or reject the null hypothesis. So that's a good example of how imputed data can make a difference in how we might interpret the outcome of a study. So that's again how we would actually then use the imputed data to do some kind of an analysis. Okay, now let's go ahead and review the output created by the imputation process. So the first thing we'll see, and it's going to be labeled multiple imputation, is the imputation specification. So this is basically just kind of a summary of what we told SPSS to do. In other words, how we wanted it to analyze the data and how we wanted it to impute the data. The second table, the imputation constraints, again simply lists what we specified on the constraints tab prior to running the process. So this will kind of give us a record of how we set up the imputation process so we can keep track of this. And so if we wanted to make changes, this would allow us to have a record of what we did or didn't do if we did additional imputations with slightly changing the parameters. Now the next 2 tables, the imputation results and imputation models, simply display what occurred during the imputation process. So it basically gives us a record of what SPSS did in each of our imputation sequences. And then if we go down to the imputation models, again, we see the same thing. So as we look at neuroticism, it had 58 missing values and came up with 290 imputed values. And then again, we can see what each of the models looked like for each of the variables. So again, it did a linear regression looking at each of these different variables as possible predictors on what the missing value of sex should be. In other words, what the imputed value for sex should be. So it uses all of these other variables and looks at the relationship among these and comes up with a predictor. What should be the missing value for sex if one individual had values for each of these other variables? So it basically comes up with a prediction of what the missing value should be, does that 5 times, imputes 5 different values of what it could possibly be, and then gives us a pooled value that we can then use in further analysis. Okay, and the next thing we can look at is the descriptive information, and I'm going to page down here. So now here is the descriptive statistics for each of our variables. So in this case we see sex and age. So if we look at the imputed values as far as the number of missing values for in each of the imputations, and then it shows the proportion of male and female in the complete data after the imputations. And you can see the proportions change actually very little from imputation to imputation, and then we would pool this to do any analysis. And if we look at age, which is a numeric variable, we can again see the same thing. We have a mean, we have a standard deviation, and here's what the mean was for the original data, and here's the mean after each of our imputations. And again, what we typically will see is now once we run an analysis, SPSS will give us a pooled mean or a pooled frequency that we would use in our analysis, whether we're doing a chi-square, whether we're doing a t-test or an ANOVA, and those are the values we would then report. So that's pretty much it. That's the process. So many analyses in SPSS are able to consider imputed data and then offer pooled output. In other words, showing the results of the analysis for each imputation set and also giving us a pooled result like we saw in our t-test example. So to summarize, what we can use multiple imputation to do is replace missing values from data. So if we wanted to maintain a certain sample size, or if we felt like trimming subjects with missing values from our data set might create some bias or might now create a non-representative sample, we can use multiple imputation to replace those missing values and it gives us a reasonable assurance that the values that are replaced through the imputation process are appropriate and match the other data that's not missing, and also does a fairly good job of predicting what the actual value may have been for that person, and then replaces that, makes that prediction and replaces that missing value with this imputed value. So it's a fairly simple process. It has obviously multiple steps that we have to go through, but it is a process that can be done. And it is a process that is becoming well accepted, but it does take a little bit more documentation. You do have to report quite a bit more when you do this process. And what I'll do is I'll also include some references, published references that go along with this multiple imputation process if you'd like to do some more in-depth reading. And I think you'll find it to be a great way to try and salvage missing data, as well as to try and determine if there are any patterns to missing data, which can be important as you describe your sample or the population that you may be studying. So hopefully you learned something in this video, and Please let me know if you have any questions or comments about this presentation.